What's up, y'all? Winnie here, and today we're going to be starting to learn about the Ultramarines. Since I'm playing Space Marine right now, I might as well learn about the Ultramarines, and I'll also be at some point starting to learn about the Orcs too. So, we are the Ultramarines, the sons of Guilliman. I'm going to have to say his name a bunch, aren't I? Whilst we draw breath, we stand. Whilst we stand, we fight. Whilst we fight, we prevail. Nothing shall stay our wrath. Marnius Caliger, Chapter Master of the Ultramarines. Alright, so, the Ultramarines are considered one of the strongest and most honored of all the Space Marine chapters in the Imperium of Man, and were responsible for almost single-handedly holding the Imperium together after the Horus Heresy. Highly disciplined and courageous warriors, the Ultramarines have remained true to the teachings of Primarch Rob Guilliman for 10,000 standard years. The Ultramarines were originally the 13th Space Marine Legion before the reforms that initiated the second founding and reshaped the Imperium after the heresy in the time of rebirth on the orders of Guilliman himself as the Lord Commander of the Imperium and Imperial Regent. It says here their war cry is courage and honor, and we march for Macragge. So, the name Ultramarines is a nod to the chapter's galactic region of origin, its standing among the other Space Marine chapters, and their role as a source for the gene seed of more chapters of the Adeptus Astartes than any of the other former first founding legions combined. The culture of the Ultramarines is loosely themed upon the culture of Old Earth's ancient Roman Empire, as exemplified in their Astartes High Gothic names and the strict adherence to the Codex Astartes, as well as the society of their homeworld of Macragge and the chapter's method of recruitment. I assume the majority of that is going to be explained since we are on the page for the Ultramarines, and as I'm scrolling, the bar on the side hasn't even really moved at all. The Ultramarines directly rule the subsector of space in the Segmentum Ultima and of the Galactic East known as Ultramar, as a fief of the Imperium, and their chapter master is also considered the Lord of Macragge and the Master of Ultramar. Of all of the 1,000 and more Space Marine chapters in the Imperium, it is the blue-clad Ultramarines that, in the mind of the countless billions of the Emperor's subjects, personify everything that the Adeptus Astartes stands for. The Ultramarines and their many successor chapters have stood at the very forefront of the war against the traitor, the alien, and the daemon since the very foundation of the Imperium. Across the domains of the Emperor, the Ultramarines are celebrated as heroic, virtuous, and noble defenders of humanity, their deeds recorded in devotional works the length and breadth of the galaxy. Okay. And all of this is just the opening. We haven't even actually hit the article yet. Even amongst the Space Marine chapters themselves, the Ultramarines occupy a position of special honor. The gene seed from which the original Ultramarines Legion was founded is considered the purest that remains, and it is estimated that some 2/3 of chapters across the galaxy share their inheritance, being either direct successors or created from tithed Ultramarines' genetic material. This shared inheritance often ensures that when the Ultramarines go to war, they are supported by many other chapters, and that when Space Marine commanders gather to consider a common strategy, the Council of the Ultramarines is greatly valued. Often, the presence of even a small number of Ultramarines units in a larger military undertaking will ensure the participation of many more chapters, so highly are the sons of Guilliman held in their brother's esteem. When the Hive Fleet Behemoth, there's them again, struck the eastern fringe, it was the Ultramarines chapter that turned the tide, even at the cost of the chapter's entire veteran First Company. At the chapter homeworld of Macragge, one of the largest battles seen in centuries was fought, with the Ultramarines led by their master Marnius Caliger at the very forefront. In addition to the great honor won by the chapter in that titanic struggle, the Ultramarines gained invaluable experience in fighting these vile Xenos, which they have passed on, often via service in the Death Watch, to many other chapters. I thought it was going to say which Xenos. But we know that it's the Tyranids. When the Horus Heresy erupted, the Ultramarines were long prevented from defending the throne world by the great ruin storm conjured by the Word Bearers during the Battle of Calth that cut the galaxy in half for long years. By the time the ruin storm dissipated and the Ultramarines could move to reinforce Terra, the War Master Horus' siege of Terra was already underway. Nevertheless, the Ultramarines fought their way towards Terra, and although they defeated a massive traitor space fleet, they were unable to reach the Sol System in time to intervene in the final battle. It is Guilliman's actions subsequent to the Horus Heresy that made him the figure of adoration that he would become. With the traitors scattered and the Emperor, to all intents and purposes, lost to humanity, the Imperium stood at the precipice. It was the genius and leadership of Guilliman that saw the Imperium through its first standard century after the heresy, as he kept invaders at bay and saved the scattered human worlds from collapsing into anarchy, reforming the imperial bureaucracy and the armed forces as needed. He fell at the hands of his erstwhile brother, the Daemon Primarch Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children Traitor Legion, at the Battle of Thessala in 121 of the 31st. Poisoned unto death, Guilliman's barely living body was placed in a stasis field and later enthroned in the Ultramarines' fortress monastery. There it remained for 10,000 standard years until he was resurrected by a combination of Imperial science and Eldari mysticism during the 13th Black Crusade in circa 999 of the 41st. He would take up the mantle of Lord Commander of the Imperium and the Imperial Regent once more, and now leads the defense of mankind from the darkness brought by the birth of the Great Rift at the dawn of the Era Indomitus. The Ultramarines are by far the best known and most celebrated Adeptus Astartes chapter in the long and bloody history of the Imperium of Man. Statues of their Primarch and their greatest heroes rear high above countless plazas and city gates, and the images of their myriad victories glow from stained glass windows in the mightiest Basilicas Imperialis. The Ultramarines Legion was the largest of those bodies raised to prosecute the Great Crusade so long ago, and as a result, it provided the largest number of chapters when the second founding occurred in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. You already said this? In addition, the gene seed is held to be pure, after so stable that 10,000 years later, mutation is well within tolerable limits. For this region, a majority of Space Marine chapters extant in the 41st millennium are thought to be related. Already said that. At once the exemplar of everything a Space Marine aspires to, and the template by which he acts, fights, and worships. Every chapter has its own traditions, histories, and battle honors, but the Ultramarines are the standard by which many others, especially those of their genetic lineage, judge themselves and their peers whether they acknowledge it or not. It is through the dictates of the Codex Astartes that the 10,000 Terran years of wisdom and expertise gleaned by the Ultramarines are enshrined. This vast reserve of lore was authored by the Ultramarines Primarch, Guilliman himself, wherein he laid the foundations of the Imperium's reformation during the time of rebirth in the aftermath of the calamitous wars of the Horus Heresy. Guilliman was a leader of prodigious intellect and not just in military fields. With the Imperium brought to its knees by galactic civil war, he turned his mind to uniting and codifying the highest echelons of the Imperium's government, imposing order on institutions that had been split asunder by the anarchy of the heresy. Only a Primarch, a gene son of the Emperor himself, could have conceived such an undertaking. For the scattered Imperial worlds that had survived the heresy were on their knees, riven with plague and famine and rife for rebellion or invasion. And this is a picture of an Ultramarines Primaris Marine. The task was gargantuan, and no mere mortal could have faced it without going mad. Guilliman offered leadership and hope, and he became a figurehead for the reborn Imperium. Countless billions came to know his name, and while he could never replace their beloved Emperor, Guilliman was a firm hand when it was needed most, and the Imperium endured. In committing his wisdom to the first volumes of the Codex Astartes, Guilliman must have known that he would not see his most cherished ambitions fulfilled. After all, none had ever imagined that a Primarch might know death, but the Horus Heresy had seen several slain or otherwise lost, and in the years that followed, more would suffer similar fates. When Guilliman was lost to the Imperium, he left behind him countless works of wisdom and insight, and the greatest of these was the Codex Astartes. Though the Imperium would again rise to heights rivaling those of the Great Crusade and descend to depths of despair as dark as the Horus Heresy, Guilliman's wisdom would prevail. The Ultramarines were and are the guardians of that wisdom and the exemplars of all their Primarch embodied. The Codex Astartes has become a sacred text for them, a blueprint describing the ideals by which the majority of chapters organize themselves, fight, recruit, train, and operate. They rule over a region of space called Ultramar, an autonomous realm that owes no tithes to the Imperium and looks entirely to its own defense. The peoples of the various worlds of Ultramar look to the Ultramarines as both beneficent rulers, and as distant figures of legend. While the vast majority of humanity will never even see a Space Marine, let alone speak to one, the people of Ultramar are more familiar with these mighty warriors. Some even have the honor of being distantly related to one, perhaps some Sorry. This ancestor having been accepted into the chapter. The Ultramarines regard it as their sacred duty to rule their domains justly and to protect them as the source of their recruiting and resources. In this, the Ultramarines are continuing the legacy of their Primarch, whose teachings each warrior studies and memorizes over the course of his service. The Codex Astartes is such a vast body of wisdom that even the prodigious genetically enhanced mental capacity of a Space Marine is taxed with absorbing it all. Yet the Ultramarines regard it as their duty to do so, and choose to eschew the blunt tool of psycho-conditioning in favor of learning every passage by remorseless study. Each battle brother absorbs and analyzes entire chapters of the Codex, so that after several standard centuries of service, he is at once a master and a scholar of his chosen area of expertise. Within a company, especially a low-numbered one consisting of numerous long-service veterans, it is likely that the entire Codex Astartes will be known by the Battle Brothers, allowing its commanding captain to draw upon an enormous pool of wisdom as well as experience. A veteran Ultramarines Battle Brother is therefore a deeply learned individual, schooled in every nuance of the arts of war and the wisdom of his Primarch. We are 11 minutes into the video and have only just reached the table of contents. Why is this website written like this? Why is the opening paragraph of every page of this website a freaking essay? Just get to the part where they're actually talking about the contents. All of this could have been in there, in the chapter history. Now you're just going to repeat yourself again for no reason. Always with the repeating of yourself for no reason. So, chapter history. At the outset of the cataclysmic civil war created by the treachery of Horus and the machinations of the dark powers of the warp, the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, stood as one of the single most powerful military forces in the Imperium. With an active fighting strength somewhere in the region of 250,000 Legion has Astartes, a sector spanning domain under their overlordship and an arguably unparalleled structure for the supply and training of initiates, allowing it to withstand losses that will potentially cripple other legions. It was this very strength that would make it a prime target for the Traitors' conspiracy. That's one sentence. This picture here says, Ultramarine chapter color scheme is displayed by Primaris Marine Brothers Caesaris, an intercessor of the 5th Squad of the 2nd Company and Mark 10 Tacticus Power Armor. It would be at Calth that this blow would fall, but while the legend of the Lapis Blue host of Ultramar and the strategic genius of its Primarch Guilliman were already widely promulgated by the iterators and remembrancers of the Great Crusade, the path by which it arrived at this apotheosis of power was not so well known, and in some cases, the facts actively kept secret. That one was 2 sentences. The complexities of the 13th Legion's past and the sometimes divisive and even antagonistic relationship the Ultramarines had with several of their fellow legions was also concealed. It would be this hidden history that was to bear a bitter fruit at the Battle of Calth and cast its shadow on all the wars that were to follow. Chapter color scheme as displayed by Primaris Marine Brother Galenus, an interceptor of the 7th Squad of the Ultramarines 3rd Company and Mark 10 Gravis Power Armor. The Warborn. The 13th Legion's origin lay, as with their fellows, on Terra in the closing years of the Unification Wars. Extant records from this time show that the 13th Legion's Alpha intake, the testbed raising of several thousand warriors by which its gene seed stability and adaptability was judged, was passed firmly within acceptable parameters and with no singular or notable physical mutation beyond the expected pattern, with full functionality of implanted organs to projected specifications. Psycho-organically, initiates were noted to display increased aggression, as was expected, but also a marked tendency towards cohesion and the adoption of hierarchy alongside an almost pathological dedication to the achievement of an assigned goal, particularly when compared against the psychological profiles of certain other alpha samples, such as those of the 12th and 5th Legions, later known as the World Eaters and White Scars respectively, who demonstrated more markedly heightened individualistic and fractious tendencies post-implantation. Here's this Ultramarine chapter color scheme as displayed by a Firstborn Space Marine in Mark 7 Aquila or Aquila power armor. Although much of what would then transpire for the 13th Legion's very early expansion past its test stage has been occluded by layers of the unbreachable secrecy inherent in much of the Emperor's ancient gene work, and records lost in the destruction caused on Terra by the Great Siege of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra, certain facts can still be pieced together and a hypothesis found. In terms of recruitment, evidence is apparent for a net being cast across Terra for initiates for the 13, with intake from areas as diverse as the sub-equatorial Maglev clans of Panproko, the war families of the Saragon Enclave, the proud Midafric Hive oligarchy, and, most latterly, the anthropophagic tribes of the Caucasus Wastes. As varied in culture and origin as these groups were, they all had one factor in common. They're violent and offer bitter resistance to the later stages of unification. A resistance broken ultimately in each case not by negotiated surrender but near annihilation, with, in some situations, little remaining save interned refugees and orphan populations left by the savage conflicts which had brought these people to heel. You have pre-Heresy Ultramarines Legion color scheme is displayed by Firstborn Legion Tactical Marine and Mark II Crusade power armor. It was this which led to the first informal cognomen by which the 13th Legion was known by the forces alongside which they served, the Warborn. It may be then theorized that the particular psychological effects of the 13th Legion's Gene Seed may have been used deliberately as a final weapon of unification to bleed away potential rebellion on Terra, and also further absorb the strength of the savage tribes of Old Night into the fledgling Imperium. Old Night just says Old Night. Further evidence for this can be perhaps inferred by the fact that no evidence remains of the 13th Legion seeing active deployment on Terra itself during the Unification War's bitter dregs, as both the 7th and 8th Legions, later known as the Imperial Fists and Night Lords, early incarnations were, for example, with their first full battle honors recorded as being for the first pacification of Luna and the brutal Sedna campaign at the edge of the Sol System. I need to drink some water real quick. As the earliest phase of the Great Crusade, the liberation of what became the Segmentum Solar progressed. It was discovered that this ancient and most heavily settled region of the first stellar domains of humanity held many survivors from the dark age of technology. I don't know what I was about to say. Of these were some who openly welcomed the Imperium as patron and protector, but there were also many human colony worlds who resisted Imperial compliance, either through ignorance or prideful assurance in their own strength, just as there were others who were enslaved under the yoke of Xenos oppression. The tide of conquest, however, with the Emperor at the head of the war effort, quickly gained rapid momentum, and the fledgling Space Marine legions undergoing their first great expansion were a key part of this. During the period of the 13th Legion, then around 8,000 Astartes strong, began to make its mark by taking part alongside other legions under the Emperor's direct generalship, gaining renown in notable campaigns such as the liberation of Diurnus and the destruction of the Scorvidian Xeno Empire, as well as amassing a string of successful compliance actions and solo operations on planets such as Loren Sigma, Sekel's Landing, and Nidebu. From each of these conquered human worlds, the most militant factions provided additional intakes of recruits tied for the 13th, as much as the Warborn Sons of Terra had infused their first intake. It was during this early period of the Great Crusade that the genius of the Emperor's grand design for his Space Marine legions became increasingly apparent. While each of his transhuman cadres proved itself able to fight on any battlefield and achieve victory, the Emperor had clearly patterned in the alchemical mix of his gene sons a diversity of tempers and abilities that had given each legion a particular tactical strength or suitability to a theater of war of its own beyond that of its peers. In some cases, these talents were atavistic and invisible, be they the near preternatural fury already being displayed by the 9th Legion, the Blood Angels, or the uncanny resilience of the 14th Legion, the Death Guard. In others, they were more subtle and bred in the bone, such as the aggressive darkness which consumed the souls of the 8th Legion Night Lords, and they could manifest in word and deed to the ruin of their foes, or the unyielding, cold, passion, and technological aptitude of what was already becoming known as the Iron Tenth, Iron Hands. It was into this latter category which the 13th Legion fell. In them was found a mixture of aggression and restraint, discipline and determination which rendered them supremely suited for joint task force operations and cross-theater warfare. The Legion also gained significant success in independent operations where it took direct command of the secondary mortal support forces of the Imperialis Auxilia, whether the professional or elite regiments of the Solar Auxilia and the regiments of the Old 100, or the often resentful and fractious host of Imperialis militia auxiliary recently forced into Imperial compliance. That was written really weird. In the latter case, the 13th Legion often detached cadres of its own warriors to act as provosts and disciplinarians if needed, handing out final justice to the recalcitrant and inspiring bravery from the front lines. Duties at which many other legions balked at as beneath their honor or as a poor use of legion as Astartes in battle. In their adaptability and range of operations, they were said to be reminiscent of the vaunted First Legion Dark Angels and the prominent Luna Wolves. The key to their fighting style was imitation and adaptation. Their own arts of war have evolved quickly from the tenets laid out during their indoctrination and training, becoming combined with influences drawn from the host of martial cultures from which they were founded and the other legions alongside which they served, from the knifecraft of the Velpaki gangs of Hive Core to the armored warfare tactics of the 10th Legion. Brotherhood of the 13th. By the third solar decade of the Great Crusade, the 13th Legion had begun to develop a distinct character of their own. They were recorded as having a practical and forthright mien, with little time given to the esoteric arts of warfare or conjectural strategizing, preferring a direct approach of swift engagement. In warfare, they relied upon this rapid attainment of quickly defined tactical objectives and strategies born of tried and tested battlefield experience and determined by the situation at hand. They also had their pride, and while they were accorded as being unwaveringly loyal to the Imperium's cause, they developed a tendency to guard their honor well and engaged in an open rivalry of achievement with the other legions alongside which they served, particularly those whose primarchs had already been recovered. The warrior brotherhood of the 13th Legion had also begun to display its achievement visually, but rather than take on a particular livery and iconography as a whole as the 3rd Legion Emperor's Children or the 14th Legion, at that time still the Dusk Raiders, had, individual companies who had come to prominence in a particularly important compliance operation or campaign took on additions to their core Legion livery, which maintained the post-unification storm gray and gunmetal that they had worn since the Sedna campaign to commemorate their greatest achievements. Those companies who had fought alongside the 8th Legion in the purgation of the abhuman corsairs of the Canceri Nebula afterwards bore black gauntlets, midnight blue helms, and the ancient Terran weighing scales and Death's Head icon of judgment in heraldic opposition of their Legion numeral, and took the name of Nemesis as their own. Conversely, the principally armored formations of the 13th Legion, who had halted the Orc advance on the ash plains of Cypra Mundi, and in doing so had saved a city of millions from a savage death, afterwards commemorating the battle by mirroring on their right pauldron the emerald light of the blazing armor borealis that had riven the skies under which they had fought. Such honors were claimed as the Legion's strength made visible, but for them no formal name for the Legion as a whole was desired save for its number, as their first Lord Commander Gren Vasotho is recorded to have said, "I'm told that once the numeral 13th was taken as an ill omen by the weak-minded, and those enslaved by the lies of superstition, but in the Emperor's service we will make it a byword for redemption and glory." The sorest test of the Legion's resolve and their arts of war was yet to come, however, which is probably this rebellion right here, since y'all wrote it like that. This is a post-heresy Ultramarines chapter Terminator armed with a Stormbolter. By the year 833 of the 30th millennium, The 13th Legion had increased in number to an active force of around 33,000 Space Marines, whose primary battle group now consisted of the autonomous 12th Expeditionary Fleet. This expansion of their number in a relatively short space of time had been due to two principal factors. The first was that their particular style of warfare had a tendency to avoid casualties where possible, compared to the tactics employed by certain other legions. Is it going to say which legion, or just legions? The 13th Legion avoided battles of attrition and prided themselves on achieving strategic goals with the minimum expenditure of life, and where salvageable human worlds were involved, this desire was also extended to the minimization of civilian collateral damage. The second was a laterally revealed aspect of their gene seed. While the rates of gene seed implantation success for the 13th Legion's zygote types were very close to the median level, it had proven to be in the highest resistance bands to errors during extensive replication, a meridian match only by the First Legion's own core sample, suffering relatively little mutation or deviation in the subsequent generation of harvested Astartes organs. This allowed the Legion to steadily expand its number even without the genetic stabilization brought by the availability of a Primarch's own mature gene code. At this time, the Emperor, in command of the might of the Principia Imperialis Expeditionary Fleet, Varus Manus and his 10th Legion, and Horus and his Luna Wolves, respectively, led the three main thrusts of the Great Crusade. They were pushing on into the outer void far beyond the Segmentum Solar. But such was the size, self-sufficiency, and genetic stability of the 13th Legion that the 12th Expeditionary Fleet alone was entrusted with the task of exploring the extent of the inner galactic disk and its densely packed star system's coreward of Terra. This was why, when a secession crisis unexpectedly flared up close to the Capitoline systems of the Segmentum Solar itself, the 13th Legion was the closest available legion and the swiftest to respond. The Osiris Cluster, a grouping of 11 star systems making up the inner portion of the Segmentum Solar's second quadrant, had suddenly and without warning declared secession from the Imperium. Chartist merchant vessels had been seized, Imperialis Armada naval patrol squadrons fired upon, and driven off by system defense ships, and agents of Imperial authority rendered silent and assumed dead. The inhabited worlds of the Osiris Cluster, many technologically advanced at contact, had originally come into compliance during the Great Crusade's 8th standard year in relatively bloodless order. It had been viewed as a highly successful campaign in which the 13th Legion itself had a hand. That the Osiris Cluster had now fallen into open rebellion was deemed an affront to the Legion's honor by its lower commander, Grand Vasotho, and the Legion Master of the 13th Legion had vowed to bring the matter to a resolution as swiftly and emphatically as possible. Vasotho, acting on initial intelligence reports, ordered the warships of the 12th Expeditionary Fleet to proceed directly to the Halo world of Septus 12, leaving behind the fleet's support elements, lumbering troops, transports, and 4 ships guarded by its slower combat vessels. The target of this rapid strike force was to be the atmospherically sealed city of Cabasset, located on the night side of Septus 12 and the economic and political capital of the Osiris Cluster. A strike there before the rebels had time to consolidate their forces, Vasotho reasoned, might end the rebellion in a single bloody stroke. Breaking into real space in the outer system, the power of the 12th Expeditionary Fleet's 2 score of capital warships, led by the Legion's flagship, the Goliath-class macro battleship Sathal's Thunder, easily swept aside the system defense monitors and fire ships to intercept them. Immediately after the short firefight, in which the Space Marine ships sustained no losses, they engaged in a brief and equally successful long-range precision bombardment to defang Septus 13's orbital defenses before moving on to attack the planet itself. I feel like that was supposed to be Septus 12. Vasotho had formulated a plan of attack based around a decapitation assault against the government of the environmental control complexes on which all life in the hive city of Cabasset was dependent for survival. The strategy was a variation of a tried and proven tactic, in part developed from close observation of the Luna Wolves' mastery of such attack forms, and which promised a quick resolution to the minimum of damage to the hive world's infrastructure and an object lesson and the futility of rebellion against the rule of the Emperor. The plan itself was predicted on detailed prior knowledge of the world as an imperial holding and a military assessment of the potential numbers and capabilities of the rebellious militia forces the Legion had projected to encounter. Unfortunately, every assumption Visotho and his command staff had made about what awaited the Legion was wrong. Catching some water again, because my mouth is just completely dried out right now. Attack on Septus 12. The attack began well enough, with the close support fire of the Sathalan's Thunder opening up great rents in Hive Kabaset's protective outer shell, into which Visotho personally led his Legion Stormbirds to the attack. Resistance was immediately far heavier than expected as the landing force became swiftly bogged down in human waves made up at first hundreds and soon thousands of dead-eyed civilians crudely stitched into makeshift pressure suits and armed with improvised weapons of every sort, not least among them explosive mining charges converted to suicide devices. The 13th Legion quickly modified their tactics to inflict maximum attrition, but heedless of casualties, the tide of bodies pressed on in cold silence, and it was quickly apparent that this was no mere rebellion and no ordinary enemy. Unwilling to allow his attack to be stalled and his invasion forces surrounded, Visotho called down reinforcements and ordered his attacking squads to press on, relying on speed and coordination, as well as the superiority of his Space Marines in close quarters combat to carry the battle. Slowly and with steadily growing losses, the Legiones Astartes forced their way deeper into the Hive City and one by one began to claim their tactical objectives, crushing better armed but equally vacant-minded opposition formed of what had once clearly been the bodyguard cadres of the Hive City's nobility. But once the 13th Legion was heavily committed and kilometers deep into the Hive, the trap was sprung. A Xenos fleet of unknown type and origin comprising 5 vast hourglass-shaped vessels whose structures turned and rotated ceaselessly like clockworks, appeared with great speed from within the fiery corona of the Septus giant star. Realizing that disaster that was about to unfold, Visotho called a general retreat from the surface, but as his forces battled to return to their gunships and transports, the assault on the Space Marines intensified as the nature of the attacks began to change. While the waiting Stormbirds fell under concerted all-out attack in an attempt to cripple or destroy them, fresh mobs of grasping civilians poured from side junctures and corridors, their intention not to kill but to overwhelm and pinion individual Legiones Astartes, drowning them in their massive bodies, heedless of the cost of life. Above them in the void, the two fleets clashed. The great hourglass craft, each easily outmassing the gargantuan Sathalan's Thunder, lashed out with blazing whips of elemental particles, scorching and burning the Imperial warships and engulfing any fighter squadrons or torpedo salvos that came close in collapsing gravitational singularities, annihilating them utterly. The 12th Expeditionary Fleet was overmatched, but fought on valiantly, causing one of the Titanic Xenos craft to fall back, strangely colored vapors bleeding luminously from its rent hull, but at the cost of a dozen of its own number, while the Sathalan's Thunder, at that point a burning wreck, tumbled out of control through the line of battle. It was then that fearful figures, aglow from within with sickly light, began to materialize among attackers both on the surface and directly onto the warring Imperial vessels. Armored in some form of Baroque biomechanical containment suits, the creatures within were barely corporeal, ghoulish shapes of glowing mist whose gauntlets spat ethereal fire and whose alien wills reached out to crush the minds of those who resisted them. Visotho's final command was for the fleet to withdraw with as many of the 13th Legion as could be recovered, but withdraw it must. A new enemy of the Imperium had been met, and word of it must reach Terra at any cost. Was this... This sounds like it's too early to be the Necrons, but it sounds like it's the Necrons. Visotho committed his life to the command of the rearguard on the surface, as penance for his error, and his last act was to transfer Legion command to the most senior surviving commander present in orbit, First Master Marius Gage. It was a testament to Gage's swift thinking and tactical acumen that he was able to hold off the enemy vessels until every surviving songbird from the ground assault had departed the planet, fighting a swirling three-dimensional battle of thrust, counter-thrust, and retreat, which held the enemy Titan ships at bay until the 12th Expeditionary Fleet had fought its way clear. Ultimately, what could have been a disaster had been fought into a mere defeat, and when all was afterwards measured, the 13th Legion had suffered a little over 6,500 Space Marines lost, the largest tally of any single battle in the Legion's history. Although this was approximately a fifth of its fighting strength in terms of Astartes, The loss counted among them much of the elite of the Legion, many of them Terran veterans from its founding, and its Lord Commander Gren Fazotha with them. Its fleet had also suffered heavily, with a quarter of its warships lost or irrevocably damaged, not least of all its flagship. Just as bitter a blow was to the Legion's pride and honor at the defeat to which their overconfidence had led them. They hungered for vengeance, but even this was denied them. When the 13th Legion returned to the now quarantined and blockaded Osiran cluster a little under a standard year later, it was a force heavily augmented from the Solar Armada, elements of the 18th Legion Salamanders, and specialist anti-psyker cadres from Terra. Of the enemy's uniforms the official biologists had designated Osiran Cybrid, there was no sign. Instead, the Imperials found worlds either left as wastelands of the unburied dead or locked in turmoil and civil strife. Piercing together fragmentary records from planetary dataspheres and human minds alike, all but purged clean, it was impossible to know from where the Xenos had come or where they had gone, only that they had operated covertly at first, insidiously claiming worlds outright, burning out the wills of their populations, stealing away some bodily into the void, and leaving the others to simply mindlessly perish by starvation or inaction in their absence. Other worlds that they had sent first into rebellion and then strive through covert psychic domination of their rulers and manipulation of their population's fears. The revelation was of a foe perhaps not numerous, but both insidious and frighteningly powerful. A clear threat now marked for extermination by the Emperor's own writ. In the wake of the short campaign, empty of glory, which brought the remains of the Osiris cluster back into the Imperium's control for repopulation, the 13th Legion swore a blood oath of vengeance against the Xenos wherever and whenever they might appear again. The Legion, now under Marius Gage's stewardship as the new Lord Commander and Legion Master, reorganized and sought to quickly replenish its numbers and supplies, and afterwards redoubled its efforts in the Great Crusade service, as if trying with each fresh victory to prove that the defeat at Septus 12 had been an aberration never to be repeated, and the name of its lost master, and indeed the battle in which he fell, became a thing no longer spoken of, but which dwelled as a shadow at their shoulders. There existed within the Legion now a brooding sense of loss and a canker of doubt in its own abilities, and in the hearts of its legionaries grew the desire, always present but now lent keen impetus, to reunite with their Primarch as a balm to all their ills, to become, as they saw it, whole. The dark irony was that more than 2 Terran years previously, unknown and withheld from the Legion's knowledge, and before the events at Septus 12, their Primarch had been located by the Emperor, but owing to the vagaries of the warp, contact could not prove possible for several more standard years. During this period, brief as it was, and yet seeming an eternity to the Sons of the 13th, the Legion fought on with a relentless but joyless hunger for battle, taking world after world for the Great Crusade in rapid succession, but shunning now both the laurels of victory it had once courted and the respect of its peers it once craved, until the hour of its salvation came at last. And that feels like a good stopping point for the introduction of Guilliman, whose first name I hate trying to say because I'm never sure how to pronounce it. But it comes up so often that I'm growing a dislike for the man just because I don't like saying his name. But that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, a like and subscribe will be groovy. If you want to click the bell, you can do that as well to be notified of future uploads. And I will see y'all in the next video, which will hopefully be the end of the Blood Angels. And then after that will be the beginning of the Orcs. So, later.